Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my incredibly special guest this week is none other than Chris Horner. Chris is a lawyer, unfortunately, but he's also a hero because he is one of my fellow combatants in the battle against climate evil and against the green blob. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, James.
Chris, we've just been on a walk around my country estate, and you was halfway to telling me, and I thought, stop there, Chris, save this for the podcast. You were halfway to telling me about the moment when your eyes were opened as to the evils of the whole climate change scam, and it had something to do with your early days as a lawyer at Enron. Tell me the story.
Okay, well, I was, as I like to say, innocently practicing law in Washington when I was given an offer to go in-house with everyone's favorite company at the time. It was an energy company out of Houston, very close with the White House, the Clinton-Gore White House, tight with the governor of Texas, who people said was going places, and a free market pioneer, I was told, and the professional opportunity of a lifetime. And I was the fully grown man, very relatively young, and I was given the offer of Director of Federal Government Relations for Enron. So I leapt at it, and within days found myself in meetings with green pressure groups and BP, American Utilities, the gas lobby, the Union of Concerned Scientists on my left, all in the same room in fancy Washington law conference rooms, scheming on how to get a global warming treaty. This was, in fact, 20 years ago last month. It was 1997 when there was not yet a Kyoto Treaty. And I asked a few questions, and it didn't go over well, and they said, we didn't fully explain our business model to you in the interview process, which there really wasn't one. It was essentially a job offer, which I was enthusiastically encouraged by my firm to take. And they said, you see, we just bought the world's largest windmill company on the cheap because, of course, it's not economic. Now, I'm adding my editorialisms here, but it was Enron Wind. It had been Zond Wind, then it was Enron Wind, and it's now called GE Wind. They had the world's second largest gas pipe outside of Gazprom. They had a coal trading business, and it was profitable, but it was a sacrificial lamb if they were to make the big bucks, which was Ken Lay's plan. He bought, as everyone around that table, at least on the right side, they had these investments that they'd purchased on the cheap because they weren't economic, but they had a plan, and that was the political economy of having their friends in government rob Peter to pay them. And so BP had its solar and its wind. It was beyond petroleum at the time, as you recall. I don't know if it still is. Someone might check, but they were, and very noisy about it. And anyway, it turned out to be very typical Enron. I was gone within weeks. Our philosophies didn't mesh. But it was the moment my inner liberal came out, classical liberal. There's several Far Side cartoons that become very relevant throughout the story. But one I like to use is the two cowboys or settlers. They've got their Conestoga wagons, and they're hiding behind it as the flaming arrows come in. And one says, they're lighting their arrows on fire. Can they do that? And I was thinking, we're sitting around a table with green pressure groups and what we call the Baptists, and then the bootleggers, BP, Enron, and some utilities and so on. And we were scheming on how to rob Peter to pay Paul. We were going to get a treaty to make the Greens happy. It was going to have cap and trade to make Enron happy. It was going to exempt, and others, it was going to exempt India, where Enron was building coal-fired power plants. They were designing this machine.
And how upfront were they in these meetings about what they were doing?
Well, that's why we were meeting, and they called it, well, as upfront as they ever are. The coalition went through various iterations. BCSE was one of them. It was Business Council for Sustainable Environment, then Sustainable Energy, and then Energy Future, and so on. So as upfront as greenwashing ever is, or rent-seeking, where they were simply, you buy things that aren't economic, therefore you get them at a good price, and then because you have a very successful government relations office and an eye for talent, clearly, you're going to add value to them through your friends in government. It was all save the world. It was all about as honest as the global warming rhetoric is. We must be paid to stop killing the planet. We absolutely must be paid to stop killing the planet.
So even the BP guys were paying lip service to this stuff.
There were four more. They rebranded their company, as you know. It was. I mean, you look at their annual report and you wonder where the Beyond Petroleum came from, because you're in no way beyond petroleum.
Did it not have wind turbines on the front of that?
It did.
I think it did.
And they were heavy into solar, of course, but they were in no way ever beyond petroleum. It was marketing, the sunburst and so on, but it was rent-seeking. And look, it's just the world's second oldest profession, the newest spin on the world's second oldest profession. So it was do-gooderism, and Ken Lay branded as such, and we're very responsible and sustainable, and this is how I'm very close to the Clinton-Gore White House.
Presumably Ken Lee didn't give a damn about the environment. Or did he pretend?
Who knows? He was a crafty fellow. We found some correspondence later where Teresa Heinz Kerry was praising him and saying, "You are the environmental champion. You are the model for what industry needs to be," and so on. And she doesn't advertise those correspondence now. But it was, "Will you please be on our," whatever her group's board was. He talked the talk well enough to be their poster child until he was airbrushed out of the picture during the May Day parade photos.
Yes. Do you think also the calculation was that we've got a Democrat administration in the White House? They're going to be much more in the mood for this kind of rent seeking, or do you think they would have gone for any administration?
My take, and it's admittedly just my take, was this was simply an opportunity that he saw and tended to and watered and helped grow. It was really, look, there's always been this doomsday cult, which is what the climate change movement really is now, particularly. But there's always been this group that are dying to embrace, like grim death, any man as agent of doom theory that rolls down the Autobahn. And this was just the next one that had no currency until corporate America and BP and others decided this is a wonderful vehicle for us, while the others decided it was a wonderful vehicle for all of what their scarcity agenda. And the left, if you take a close look at the agenda, it's not that different from their long-held wish list for decades. You can't use these freedoms. You can't have these freedoms. You might use them. We'll make better decisions for you. Better to ration today than have to ration tomorrow, and so on. And it's all wrapped up in this something we can all agree on, except for a very few dissenters. I was just in London for a talk, and someone asked, essentially, how did this happen? The U.S. is the country where there is the most opposition to the climate cult agenda, and thank goodness for President Trump doing what many of us, including those who had some relationship with the transition, for example, still on occasion thought was impossible. And it was strange. We walked through the lobbies promoting this agenda because there is so much money at stake and there is something in it for everyone, except the seniors and the poor, the most vulnerable that you kill through energy poverty. But that, this is politics. There's money to be made. There was no organized lobby against this unless the Cooler Heads Coalition is this loose-knit group of policy advocacy groups and think tanks that have been together for 20 years. I had the honor of being at the Rose Garden announcement of President Trump announcing he would withdraw from the Paris Climate Treaty, which he hasn't done yet.
Day.
I sat right behind my colleague Fred Smith, who was in Kyoto 20 years prior.
Fred Smith,
explaining.
The CEI, the head guy at the CEI.
It was quite a moment, and I watched this, and I remembered this is how I met Fred. He was in Kyoto explaining, the problems with energy rationing and the benefits of skepticism and where did it go? We hardly knew after several centuries. And that was really, there just wasn't much of a lobby against this, but people, at least in the States, just knew at some level where it's still safer to speak out and express your skepticism. They sensed that they were being taken for a ride on this, that this was the Washington elites getting together, the Baptists and bootleggers, essentially the people with the better lobby, with the organized lobby, finding a way to whet everyone's beak.
Can you just explain how Baptists and bootleggers works exactly?
Let's say you desire prohibition on legalized alcohol sales,
For example.
and let's say because of a core religious belief or lifestyle views, and let's say you make illicit alcohol, you too want a ban on legal sale of drinking alcohol. And so you would get together with a group that you rarely agreed with or ever worked with, because there was something on this particular occasion. There was something in it for the both of you. The Baptists, it was a term coined by Bruce Yandel at Clemson University, but they will get together. I mean, this was a table I found myself sitting around in. I think this was May 1997, and there was the Union of Concerned Scientists with high-level executives from the American Gas Association, Niagara Mohawk Power, Enron, BP, and others. And I asked a representative from one of those entities, what were we doing around a table with people who, it was no secret, wanted all of us to be out of business? And the response was a sort of sheepish yes, but I don't really know, but I know this is strange, but they'll never go all the way, and sort of, but they want to stick the other guy first was the point. It was. I suppose that's a long way about answering your question. Were they open about what they were doing? No, even in that meeting, the guy next to me didn't say, we'll all eat like kings. This is just business. Tell Chris it was never personal.
Well, you were obviously the exception rather than the rule. There were lots of other people just like you who had legal backgrounds who joined this company and took the money and carried on doing it and didn't have any moral qualms about it.
I saw some very good people from my old firm. It was a Houston-based firm, so many lawyers went into Enron and get caught up. And I recall one straight arrow found himself testifying before Congress about the collapse, and he was in accounting law. And a lot of people may have had suspicions. Remember, I was like the guy muttering on a street corner through a surgical mask for several years about this evil company that was all about making money out of doing nothing. And it was only once the collapse came and they could tie it to then President George W. Bush that the Washington Post ever wanted to talk to me about it. And I'll tell you the interview. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. It was a story that ran around Christmas Day of 2001, maybe. And I explained over a much longer period of time this scheme, and that this was typical Enron. They were all about these schemes to make money off of doing nothing. And after the longest time, he tapped his pencil on the table and said, I suppose I could say you're telling me they weren't that bad after all. And I said, where did you possibly get that in the story I just told you? And he said, well, palms out, global warming. So it was, you said global warming? Well, sure, then whatever you ask for. I mean, you're doing the right thing. You have the presumption, you're doing the Lord's work in this case. And so you can get away with an awful lot, and maybe a lot of well-meaning people will go along with you because, the rational ignorance theory. I'm busy with very many things. I don't study this. I hear there's a 97% consensus and so on. I don't think everybody who got swept up in the Enron collapse or collapses like it were guilty of misfeasance or malfeasance, or going along for a buck. I think just things, you find yourself over time having, maybe in this case, gone along with, global warming.
Yeah. Can I say I'm rather shocked by that? That people live such unexamined lives. I mean, we're talking probably the majority of people at a corporate level in America, aren't we? People who really would rather not know the ugly details in case they find out that it actually makes them look bad. So they hear global warming. They might have read somewhere by some lunatic that wind turbines have a bad reputation for chopping up birds and bats and so on. But they don't want to find out too much in case, that's the business model of their company gone.
Don't limit it to the corporate world. Think about politicians too. In both cases, politicians may be a better example, they seek the path of least resistance, which means I'd like a way to rationalize doing this. Right. I'm going to face endless town hall meetings of this spittle-flecked, banner-waving, you're killing children allegations, what about the planet? And there's no, as we discussed, no organized lobby to support me if I say, did you know how many seniors are dying from energy poverty in countries where these policies are taking root? There's just...
Why is there not a lobby for that?
Well, let's take that particular example. Who dies from energy poverty? Seniors who don't have family around. You don't have to freeze to death, right? Hypothermia comes when you are forced to choose between heating and eating. And it is now epidemic here in the UK. And it has spiked dramatically to crisis levels coincident with these policies taking root. And it's not as The Guardian wrote once, higher energy prices are not a bug, they're a feature of this agenda. Well, when the President of the United States, or soon to be, said, I'm going to cause your electricity rates to necessarily skyrocket, it seems truly never to have occurred to him and that might really harm some people, because consider the life he's living. Most politicians don't see these most vulnerable who are left alone. That's who dies of hypothermia. So that's why to the extent there's an organized lobby, there are pressure groups that I see headlines in the UK about why were these people left to die, these pensioners, by social services.
I suppose age concern or similar charities might.
Right, and that there are, if you look at the US government websites, there are many cautions, increasing cautions about how the most frail and the most vulnerable have to take particular care. And this is of unique concern now that we are, through policy, causing energy prices to skyrocket. But back to the question, the politician or the businessman would like, the preference is, can I find a way to make a buck off this? Because it's inevitable, like so many things that crashed and burned. It's inevitable, right? Why don't is there something in it for us? And if not, can we design a pass-through? I don't think that's overly cynical. This is my experience. You have for Washington, very seeming straightforward, honest people who still will report back to headquarters and say, our industry association thinks we can find a pass-through. The idea of saying no is alien to most of them. It's the political culture. It's the corporate culture. It's certainly the lobbying culture. You can make a lot of money in Washington as a wise man saying something that is utterly absurd to me. Well, you can't just say no. Well, of course, you don't have to read history to know that sometimes you even have to say no. Of course you can say no. But it's not really in their lexicon. It's how do we find a pass-through? Maybe there's something we can do for the bottom line, which was the issue.
Do you know, I still haven't got rid of the really annoying The Entertainer ringtone on my phone. My daughter put it on to annoy us. And it's just da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And people think that it's the sort of thing because I think this is not the first time it's interrupted a podcast. And people think it's my choice. And I'd like to say to all my listeners, no, my bloody daughter. Anyway, Chris, before we round off this section, I just wanted to ask you to define a term that I often use on this podcast, and you've used it yourself, rent-seeking. Problem with rent-seeking is the actual phrase. People think rent, paying rent, but what is rent-seeking exactly?
I was just on the train the other day. I was looking at some things that passed by, and I thought, here's a good example. And it was there were obviously many more rail lines here than there are in the States in terms of density. And what if you're GE or I forget the engine manufacturer I saw, you make train engines, and you think the United States really ought to have more trains. You would work with your friends in policymaking to coerce or mandate, whatever, use the power of the state to ensure that more people rode the train. You make guardrails. You sell galvanized metal. You think, as a safety measure, you will make the safety arguments, and you may set up the National Galvanized Rail Safety Institute to advocate for installing galvanized safety guardrails on every inch of every road and byway in the United States. You are rent-seeking. You are, as I said, it's the world's second oldest profession. You're seeking to use your friends in government to make people or coerce them to buy your stuff. And in fact, if you think about it, particularly in the green jobs realm and during the stimulus debate, there, in this case, it's at its worst because their entire sales pitch was, unless you make people buy our stuff, we won't be in existence. And the proper argument is, then go broke. Because what you're telling me is, even if I do give you this bag of money or this mandate, when it ends, when it sunsets, you'll go broke because you're not economic. But the problem is in Washington, as you know, you can't just say no. You have to haggle. It's the bazaar. And it certainly is. And so that's why Washington is recession proof. That's why it is so crowded when I go in. It's because it is all of these national institutes for so-and-so that are set up by parties to either protect something, or it isn't simply to defend against the encroaching state, which is a noble cause and a need for square footage in Washington office space. But it is to compel markets for what you do. I make some energy source, and it is intermittent. It is very expensive. It takes up a lot of land. It's a bird-chomping eco-crucifix, but it's just not fair that I don't make as many as I'd like to. I need to use the state to compel people to use it, and I'm going to argue that I'm new. I mean, you're new. The windmill is new. Okay, if you had an argument, I suppose you'd make it. Instead, you're saying you're new. Okay, so wind was commercialized in what? The 80s, 1887. Solar was 1891, coal 1883. They're contemporaries. The difference is one of them's economic. Two are still living in their parents' basement, the parent being the taxpayer. They say we just need a chance to compete. Good, move out. Kick them out. Give them a chance to compete. But instead, they are parasitical. They are now moving from the old arguments, however they got Jimmy Carter to increase their subsidies. And I don't know if you've seen the great headline, solar could provide 20% of U.S. energy needs, energy, mind you, by 2000, I think. Maybe it was 2020.
Where was that headline?
Wall Street Journal, 1978.
Wall Street Journal.
Carter to increase outlays. And I'm waiting. Now, if Jimmy Carter, who's some fella from the history books, increased your subsidy, please don't insult my intelligence and say, but we're new. You're not new. You're living in the taxpayer's basement, and it's time you moved out.
Well, I agree with that. But there's a lot of businesses, or so-called businesses, and lobbyists working against you, aren't there? I mean, how big is the lobby industry in DC?
I have no idea, but it's
vast, isn't it?
You can't swing a bag of money without gravely harming many lobbyists.
I bet you would be earning so much more money if you were a lobbyist than being on the wrong side of the law, as it were.
I think you need the right personality to be in that business, and I'm not. I'm something more of a contrarian than.
Well, yes, that is our problem. Well, I want to talk in the next section about the glorious moment in the Rose Garden. But you're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and exciting red-pilled guest, Chris Horner.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with my very special guest, Chris Horner. We were talking in the first section about the moment you were red-pilled working at Enron. I mean, you must be one of the early guys, just one of the first sentient beings to realise that something was amiss in the state of Denmark.
It was, I have to say, I was a fully grown man, but I had no experience with. I had my can they do this moment. We're sitting around a table with what are otherwise our adversaries trying to find a way to give everybody what they need. And you could say, well, this sounds great. This is compromise. That's what Washington's about. No, it was about wealth transfer. It was about robbing Peter to pay Paul, which Paul's an enthusiastic supporter of, but sometimes it's Paul's idea. So I suppose with the zeal of a convert, it struck me as so offensive. That is why I asked inconvenient questions, and it wasn't going to last very long with
So
Enron.
you and I get so much shit for what we do, don't we? I mean, we really do. We've made ourselves very unpopular characters among a large section of the populace who think we don't care about the environment, we don't care about the children. We don't think of the children at all. How much of your life of your social life do you spend defending yourself against the charge that you are evil and wrong and paid for by big oil?
Oh, I don't spend much time. I don't typically engage. Now, I have a view somewhat like yours in that I moved out some time ago, far, far away from Washington when it was, I didn't want to raise my children there, and I had privacy concerns because of what I do and the way the other side behaves and specific instances. But it's not, I don't need to engage on this. No. And my wife doesn't either. But it comes up because, remember, the rational ignorance theory plus I don't begrudge people. Well, we lead busy lives trying to create wealth for our family and protect them and make ends meet. And you don't spend your we've got experts for this or that. I can't tell you about the ark that we would take to the moon. We've got people for that. And so I don't begrudge those who say, but global warming, because that's all they hear. But if they do wish to engage and not in the usual, and look, you may have the same experience. I don't find it fruitful to share the stage with these people very often anymore because they spend their time making things up. And so you have to spend your time saying he just made something up and here's why, or calling names. And so that's not a productive endeavor.
You get bogged down.
Right.
The explanation takes much longer than the soundbite that they come up with. So you're always on the back foot.
Right. And so if somebody truly is interested, and I can tell you about a clergy person gripped my hand recently and looked at me in the eye, having just returned from a clergy retreat where they showed apparently some movie that showed me. And she was gravely concerned for my soul. This was this is a retreat for clergy where they showed, I believe, the Leonardo DiCaprio movie. And she said,
What, Titanic?
Yes. I'm very interested in your views on climate change. And I thought, well, they're not hard to find. And while I'm happy to set up the projector, if that's true, the time it would take me to do so, to even drive out, you could discern them and maybe just see. And I realized, you know what? Now that takes it too far, but this is almost here. But when you're showing a Leonardo DiCaprio film at a clergy retreat, so they can save the souls of any remaining skeptics in their parish, then some institutions have gone too far. And it's time we have to engage to say, all right, think about this. Holman Jenkins has had a great column asking, so what's the right amount to spend for no impact on climate? If you just give me the figure, then we can have that conversation. So what's the right amount to spend for this pose, for this virtuous gesture? And I just turn the prism a bit and say, what's the proper number of seniors and the poor to kill for no impact, so Leonardo DiCaprio can feel good at night, and so you can strike a virtuous pose, and because global warming. What's the right number of the most vulnerable to kill in the name of the most vulnerable? And it is killing people. These aren't computer model projections of 100 years. These in the future. These are headlines from Germany, from England, from Ireland. You know, the figure is up to 40,000 projected excess winter deaths now in England and Wales alone, skyrocketing from previous figures. And so the response is, well, we need more social programs to pay for insulation. No, I have an idea. When you find you've got a hitch in your golf swing, you don't add a different hitch to try to, you go back and solve the problem. You're killing people now through these policies that, as The Guardian acknowledged, don't have the bug of escalating energy prices, skyrocketing, as somebody said. That's the feature. Why don't you just say, look, this is a gesture. It's a pose. You're killing people. The temperature after you kill these people will be, carry the one, whatever it would have been if you didn't. Nothing ever proposed would detectably impact the climate. That's the actual consensus. So I want to leave a wealthier world, a healthier world, a more resilient world. Do you want more Florida or more Bangladesh? It's very easy. When the same storm comes and we're not outside of natural variability on any of the parade of horribles they promised, where do you want to be, college kids out there hectoring me? And they'll all say Florida. Why? And one will yell transportation, infrastructure, institutions, emergency services, automobility. Those are far too reasoned answers to actually get on campus, but they would think definitely Florida. Yeah. Why? Wealth. So do you want more Florida, which is when they say, what if you're wrong? If I'm wrong, we've created more Florida to deal with what man's always faced with, but you've left a richer, more resilient world. And we've defied all I mean, the evidence shows these computer models are wrong, obviously, that they sex up projections through their feedbacks. Because why do you rob banks, Willie? Because that's where the money is. And if they're wrong, they will have left a poorer world, a less resilient world to deal with what man's always had to deal with. And we've seen already they're killing the most vulnerable. Good heavens. What if they get their way? Well, it's something to consider, because if you look at the G20's reaction to Donald Trump giving what was just a speech so far, it still has to be formalized. And there are various ways to do this. Some will be reversed with a turnkey with President Elizabeth Warren in 2021 if things go a certain way, or some could be more permanent. But the G20, will anyone follow his lead? Will this embolden them? Will he show resolve?
Well, we've already got Turkey announcing this week.
We think so.
I mean, I'm not sure whether Erdogan is necessarily the role model we should all be.
He did, but the way he did it, he effectively acknowledged that, look, well, we were promised a bag of money. If the bag of money is not coming, then I won't play your game. Well, that's what it was about. Somebody, Francis Menton on the Manhattan Contrarian website, walked through the other 19's promises. And Indonesia's was, their promise under Paris was to burn less rainforest. It's almost like that Chevron ad. If you remember, they promised to essentially produce less energy this year, said the energy company. Indonesia's promise had nothing to do with energy use. It was if you paid them, they'd burn less rainforest, essentially. This was all...
So it's mafia-style protection racket. You pay us the money, we burn the less forest.
Right. Or China promised less than projected business as usual under Paris.
I thought you were telling me they were going to kill fewer pandas. No. Because that would be good.
No, that'll take real money. Now you're talking real money.
I mean, the WWF, it's their... The panda is their symbol, isn't it?
It is, but then look at the Audubon Society. They say that we have to put up more windmills, okay? These bird chomping eco-crucifixes, because we have to kill the birds to save them.
We have the same in the UK with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. It's extraordinary, isn't it? The Audubon Society, named after the best bird painter in the world. You'd think they might care about avian species somehow?
But climate is, you mentioned the green blob at the outset, climate has consumed the entire actual environmentalist, certainly conservationist movement. Everything has to be about climate. You remember the old line, was it Nigel Calder said, if you want to get a grant about the nut gathering habits of the brown Surrey squirrel, then throw in a line about the impacts of climate change on the nut gathering habits of the brown Surrey squirrel, and you will get your funding. It has consumed everything, such that the bird protection organizations advocate one of the greater threats to birds, certainly one of the more easily avoidable errors, because of the bigger climate theme.
Yeah. I was listening to our state broadcaster the other day, BBC Radio 4, and there was an interview with this guy who was an expert on seabirds, and he'd spent the last few years researching this book on seabirds, and he started talking about all the dangers to the seabirds, all the things that were worrying, and he mentioned the acidification of the oceans, and he mentioned plastic bags, which I agree with, and then he started talking about climate change. And the one thing this guy didn't mention was the device which is probably killing more of his beloved seabirds than anything else: offshore wind turbines. And I thought, I find this cognitive dissonance among many, not all, but many, if not most, ecologists and environmentalists absolutely inexcusable. How can you study wildlife and care about nature and yet advocate for something which destroys them on an industrial scale?
I imagine it goes on a case-by-case basis. There is cognitive dissonance out there. There is surely just pure professional wisdom, and there's fear. I mean, you don't contradict the blob and expect to prosper in your chosen field. And they have used threat. I mean, do what I want or everyone dies is their overriding theme. Never the sign of a movement confident in its ability to prevail in an actual argument, right? Can't even describe the horrors over your shoulder. It's sign here, details to follow. It's this movement premised in fear. Fear, thou shalt not speak against us. Fear that... So you can't dissent from within. They cannot brook debate from within. They cannot brook debate from without. You saw Scott Pruitt, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, saying now that he thinks that the red team, blue team discussion over climate change, the debate might be something that would benefit the public if it were televised. Well, can you imagine anything that will send them over the edge more than the prospect of televised debate over something that quite clearly, when it was all about we need Nuremberg-style trials for these whatever they were calling us before,
deniers.
You can't have debate. The debate is over, and you ask what ended it. Was it a paper? Was it Al Gore's movie? Was it a zinger like Where's the Beef? What ended the debate? I don't even remember the debate, and we have to move on beyond it. This is a movement that lives in dread fear of actually having to make their case. Well, people should read into that. But certainly from within, they've taught their own. I mean, they will eat their own. We've seen this. You do not dissent. If you want to advocate for seabirds, don't mention any threat from offshore wind.
It's very true. This is what Christopher Booker, who sends his regards, by the way, Christopher Booker calls, well, he didn't invent the term, groupthink. That one of the aspects of groupthink is that people who speak out of turn, people who don't play the game, are written off as heretics. They are victimized. They are made very uncomfortable for not participating in the generally received idea.
It's true, and that was actually a question at this London event I mentioned. It was, what role do you think groupthink plays? And I think it's. I mean, they depend upon it. It really is a principal feature of this movement to ensure. It's funny. The thing that terrifies them most is actual discussion of the issues. Just go back to the very beginning when we first started. It was so odd to hear the debate is over, and it is settled, and it was so aberrant from what you typically hear in a policy dispute, in an intellectual and a scientific dispute.
Well, outside the Soviet Union, anyway.
Okay. Which, as I've had this discussion with someone recently, an awful lot of those retreads, when the wall fell, a lot of them gravitated immediately to the Green Movement. And there are various reasons for this, but the tactics certainly are similar. Thou shalt not speak against the Green State. But think about the media. The media have this tremendous groupthink. Remember the Washington Post reporter I mentioned? He was one of their senior guys. And I explained how Enron had essentially created the global warming industry, and he palms out, pleaded for forgiveness for them on the basis that, well, I mean, global warming. There's no way you can discuss anything else. You can't actually have a discussion in the Washington Post newsroom clearly, let alone, and I can speak to firsthand experience, in the editorial board.
Yeah, as a lawyer, I mean, you've had no journalistic experience yourself, have you? You never written for a newspaper apart from
opinion pieces.
No. But as an outsider, can you explain to me something that's puzzled me about my own trade, which is, why is it that so many? Surely one of the qualities you need as a journalist is curiosity. And another quality you ought to have, I think, is this enthusiasm for putting a stick in the hornet's nest, and a sort of a naughty urge to stick it to the man. Why have all these urges been so lacking in environmental journalism?
Well, I think it's a self-selecting universe, and this is where you go to make your imprint upon the world as an activist. I mean, I will tell you, when was it? In 2000, late 2000, the first conference of the parties I ever attended was in The Hague. And it was during the Florida recount, the Bush-Gore Florida recount. And I covered it.
The Dimple Chads.
Yes. And I covered it for UPI. And that was my press credential to the COP. And I was in the plenary session when Jacques Chirac said, we need Kyoto is the first component of an authentic global governance. And that was his quote. And you could see every American in the room. Their jaw was on the floor. If you want to kill this, that's the way to discuss it. Now, that's how they speak. There is global governance. It doesn't mean global government. But anyway, you could see the Americans in the room. And James Sensenbrenner, who became the chairman of the House of Representatives Science Committee later, held an impromptu session with reporters outside of that saying, if you want to diminish enthusiasm, this is my paraphrase, I don't remember what he said, in the United States for this, then run around saying this is the first authentic component of global governance. And the Guardian journalist was pacing like this feral animal around the gaggle, saying, bollocks, bollocks. He was infuriated. Now that struck me. But then I went back to my hotel and I wrote it up. And the science editor of UPI wrote back to me saying, how dare you say this? How dare you write this? We can't do this. No one would ever say that. She had no curiosity as to whether Jacques Chirac actually said it, and it's in his remarks. But she just quashed the story saying, how dare you? No one would ever say this. That was the end of the story, and I was permitted no. But he did say it, and isn't that really why I was here? That to me that's illustrative, and this was 17 years ago, of the state of what is a very sorry, in my opinion, profession now, where they can, as I've used the example before, in just one article to the next, switch from saying George Bush refused to sign the Kyoto Treaty to he unsigned it. Wait a minute. Which time would your fact checker say was right? To he withdrew and so on, when, of course, Bill Clinton signed it. And every environmental journalist I pointed out, actually Bush couldn't sign it any more than he could sign the Treaty of Versailles. And these are basic factual matters. Would wave it away and say my editor or something else. Facts, there was a narrative. And I know the term's overused now, but there was a narrative then that it's overwhelming now. You saw the video, the famous video of the media room at the Paris climate negotiations erupt when the announcement was made that a treaty was reached, and the media room erupted in applause. They leapt to their feet and cheered
because it's their cause.
They're activists.
It's funny. You just reminded me, actually, talking about the various COP conference of the parties, all these UN meetings, which are always in pretty exotic locations, aren't they? There was one in Cancun, one in Copenhagen, the snowy one, when Air Force One arrived with Obama, and it was in a snowstorm. That was symbolic. There was one in Cape Town, was there? That
was the World Environment Summit. I attended that. That was Johannesburg. But it generally, Bonn occasionally when they're pressed to have an emergency session because there's a Republican president elected or something. But they're typically in nice locales, yes.
And so you've got these true believers all flying out. They probably know each other, I imagine. They're all friends. Staying in, how long does it last? About 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
It's 2 weeks.
So 2 weeks somewhere really nice, all expenses being paid, presumably, and all you've got to do as the price of admission is to agree with everything that the green blob says.
At the end of the second week, you need to sign on to the historic agreement to meet again next year.
Yeah, that's it. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
But don't forget the subsidiary body meeting in Bonn, where the same group travels for a very nice week every June.
There's something analogous here, which is that I had one of my best friends from university was a great believer in the European Union. And as a great believer in the European Union, he was able to go on some kind of course in Brussels, surrounded by Europhile graduates from different parts of the world, and they were given lavish expense accounts. They all were sleeping with one another, and all they had to do in return for this Shangri-La of shagging and drinking was to agree that the European Union, that ever closer union, was a desirable goal. And there was never any option for us Eurosceptics, in the same way there's never been a counter option for those of us who don't believe in the global warming scam. We don't get to go to Bali, do we?
Well, you can do what Lord Monkton did, and you can crash the party. But
we get kicked out.
They diminish the credentials that are available, and will constantly.
What?
Oh yeah, well, they will reduce. We've had experiences where we're constantly shifted around in our rooms, that when we are permitted to have side events, and then they'll cancel them and so on. They're very dodgy about that. But that, because we're not the point, ever closer union is the point, and it's a great analogy. If you think about the tantrum that the Paris Treaty represents, because they had this problem, and the problem was the democratic process. Now, the European Union turns up its nose at that, of course. It's the home of the democracy deficit. The Kyoto Treaty died because we have a supermajority requirement. And so we agreed to the Kyoto Treaty. Bill Clinton signed it. Yes, he did. And he signed it on November 12, 1998, despite unanimous instruction from the Senate not to go do that. And he signed it and said, well, we'll find a way to fix it. But he never submitted it, and the Senate never pressed the issue. Senator Hillary Clinton never pressed the issue or tried to get a vote. It was what they did is they took the lesson, just don't admit it's a treaty. And then look at Paris. Kyoto had one compliance period, and it contemplated another. Paris solved the U.S. constitutional problem. Ever closer union. It is compulsory, tightens itself every 5 years in perpetuity, and they call it not a treaty. So we get rid of the entire proper democratic process in one fell swoop. And yet, at the same time, all of these countries like the French, who lectured us over and over through their ministers that this cannot possibly be sent to the Senate for ratification as a treaty, ratified it through their legislature as a treaty. The Italians, just to get into the weeds of European constitutions, the Italian constitution requires parliamentary approval not of international agreements, but of treaties only. Guess how Italy treated Paris, the non-treaty? Like a treaty. All of these countries with parliamentary systems treated it like a treaty. They're just treating the American taxpayer like idiots. And fortunately, Donald Trump did what, if you follow, and I've got a PowerPoint presentation, yes, he ran on it. But immediately the narrative and the headlines were cancel is off the table. And you see these shocked headlines, cancel appears to be back on the table. It was never taken off the table. When we asked what changed it, what took it off the table, they would say, well, the inauguration. You just don't do that. He'll never do it. We can bully him. Amazing that they didn't.
That's going to be our final section. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest. Even though he's a lawyer, he's a good lawyer. His name is Chris Horner. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, your very special friend James Delingpole, and my very special guest Chris Horner. Chris, you were quite heavily involved in the transition teams of the Trump administration.
I was one of 8 on the landing team that had this portfolio, the EPA and the Paris Treaty.
How pleased are you how pleased are you by what Trump's done so far?
Quite. I have to say, as we discussed, there were times when some of us thought this was not possible, but
why did you think it was not possible?
Because, as the assumption was, and again, you can paint the picture through headlines. It's a remarkable sequence I've pulled together just with a quick search. You just don't do these things. George Stephanopoulos is now a journalist with ABC News, hosts their flagship Sunday program. He actually was a campaign operative for Bill Clinton, of course, as I suppose many journalists were. He famously said about Clinton, well, he kept the campaign promises he meant to keep, And it's one of these stunning statements if you're not from Washington. You know, the wise men all nodded. Well, of course, yes. Why is this strike anyone? Well, this seems to have been one of those promises Donald Trump meant to keep. From every story I'm told, every bit of information I have, this was a promise he intended to keep. And all he was told in meetings was why he couldn't keep it. And there was no one to say but what his instinct was, which is, but I said I would, and this is a bad deal. And let me tell you something. There was no one that I know of in this. None of us were Trump people, okay? But the penny dropped for us at pretty much the same moment. We all supported more. You know, they were viewed as radical Republican candidates, maybe a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio, who I will be perfectly honest and say, none of us think they would have followed through on this. None of us think President, even Ted Cruz, would have done what Donald Trump announced he was going to do. Still needs to formalize, but on June 1st in the Rose Garden. This was something that just the swamp is real, and the pressures, no matter who your family is, are spectacular. And yet he had these people who were not early Trump supporters, but who had a close familiarity with the issues, brought together and said, prepare the day 1, day 30, day 100, 2-year plan, and we'll see how we can follow it. Well, this was a remarkable event. We thought, let's try it. Well, it comes along, and it turns out everything we've obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and otherwise shows that the career and the Obama State Department people have been thoroughly dodgy to the point of they're not just misleading, they misrepresented things in their memos, their legal memoranda that are not to be released and so on. Utterly misrepresenting, again, misrepresenting the history of how we got here to just say, of course, this is what we're going to do. And there's really no way out. And all of these arguments that anyone would make, you shouldn't even listen to them. The swamp is dedicated to ever closer union. This was a career boon for the State Department. They saw a climate diplomatic corps. That entire beast is dedicated to making sure this undermining the president, still to this day. So the fact that he announced it, despite the pressures, which everything I know indicates it's remarkable that he followed through, at least in announcing that he will get out. I've in waxing not very poetic about the experience. I've forgotten what your question was, but I'll just tell you it was remarkable. As people looked each other in the eye and said, do you think we might actually do it? Well, let's lay out the options, because it does seem that he means it.
Yeah. Well, I was writing concernedly about. I went over to DC before the inauguration to dip my toe in the water and find out whether my fantasies were going to come true under Trump, or whether he was all talk. And there were some very worrying moments on the way. For example, Rick Perry. He seems to have been sort of wavering between positions, like he wants to cover his options. And again, even Scott Pruitt didn't seem as enthusiastically zealous as I might have hoped for. And then you've got Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, who is Exxon, who's big oil, and big oil, as we know, are committed to propping up this whole scam because their business model is based on crony capitalism and trying to close down the coal industry.
Yeah, the oil industry was aggressively in favor of this, and it's for reasons, simple fuel switching reasons. The gas lobby would do quite well. The gas lobby was in the room with us 20 years ago. Rick Perry, I think, is emblematic of what most of the Republican candidates that other people, including me, were supporting, to whatever that meant in cocktail conversation, whatever, blogging, early on would have done. In the end, you fold under the withering pressure of the climate industry and the beast. There is no organized lobby against it. There's so much money at stake. There is so much money being poured into it. Remember the smear effort of Myron E. Bell, who ran the Trump EPA transition team, which is how I became involved. Well, why did the New York Times and the Washington Post run coincident pieces smearing Myron, and then the entire herd followed? And this is the EPA. It's this backwater created by fiat by Nixon some time ago, agency that has consumed our economy. Why do you rob banks, Willie? It's where the money is. Why did all the money go into smearing Myron Bell? The guy running the EPA transition, light shows projected onto the EPA building, obvious product of editorial board and PR campaign meetings, all dedicated to going after the guy running the EPA transition, because this is where the money is. This wasn't the Department of Defense or even the sprawling Agriculture Department or the Health and Human Services with Obamacare. It was targeted on one guy because this was their means of discrediting the Trump energy environment agenda, which is where the wealth transfer is. And he was openly and adamantly against wanting to stop. Here's what I firmly believe. This is where I was going when I forgot, caught up in my own thoughts. I'm convinced that the penny dropped for others as it did me when Donald Trump gave his editorial board interview to the Washington Post. It's often mocked where he said, I'm not a big believer in global warming, not a big believer. And then he continued in a very important way. And if you follow the way Donald Trump speaks, to me, it's perfectly clear what he's saying. He said, a lot of people are making a lot of money off of this. He was not saying this as a politician says it. And that's inherently a good thing. And if we use spoons, not shovels, why, we'll create even more jobs. That sort of playground thinking is very common among politicians. And whatever anybody thinks about Donald Trump, you can be confident of this. At 21, at Le Cirque, somewhere, at some point, somebody who's making a killing off of the rents from the global warming industry laughed it up a little too loudly or once too often around Donald Trump, because what he said to the Washington Post was, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Goldman's making a killing with this. That's what I heard him say. And when I heard him say, he was the one I most suspected would fall for, because politicians fall for this. But Donald, it will create jobs. Oh, why didn't you say so? Instead, he said, what I heard him say, when they're making a lot of money off this, he's talking about you're propping up, sometimes even standing up industries to transfer taxpayer money to them. And he didn't go into energy poverty or the economic drag or the inefficiency or the opportunity cost of the 2.2 jobs, whatever. Yeah. He just said, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. A lot of people are making a lot of money off this. And to me, he was saying, this is something of a scam. And look, you can take his Chinese hoax comments, you can take hoax in any context. But the fact is, the way they're playing out the global warming industry, there are many scams involved. And I think he was aware of this. I do think at one point, somebody laughed a little too loudly about the money they're making off of this around him.
He does seem to be very well informed. I mean, he lets slip sometimes stuff that you know about and I know about, but I wouldn't expect politicians to know about. Who's briefing him?
My understanding of the debate was he had a going back to your comment about Scott Pruitt, it's my understanding that Scott Pruitt was a very effective, very aggressive advocate. And he just mopped up the floor with the rest of the swamp. And that includes, Trump has put together a very good cabinet. That includes some of his cabinet picks. Rex Tillerson, as you know, was advocating what made his life easier, with all due respect to him. As a Secretary of State, you say, I can do this the hard way or the really hard way. Getting out of Paris would make it the really hard way. So I'd rather you not do it. Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, to her credit, obviously has a more difficult road to hoe here. And she was bucking her boss and supporting her bigger boss, Donald Trump, saying, no, this is something we should get out of for the following reasons. So I believe she was involved in the principles discussions. I know Scott Pruitt was very effective. I know Rex Tillerson was strongly in favor of remaining, but he also has staff-level advisors. And some were very adamant, some of the Goldman guys, like Gary Cohn, but he also has people working for him who were quite well versed in the substance of the issue and made a very good case. And I think while the left in the last week has protested quite a bit too much in saying that never happened, I will tell you, contemporaneously we knew, and the subsequent postmortems that said this are accurate, the White House counsel, Don McGahn, studied the issue. The issue was not legally binding. That's a fool's errand. It's an academic point. The question was increased legal risk. Scott Pruitt made that argument. He made it relating to his life. How do I get rid of these Obama EPA rules? And others made the point. We provided documents obtained from the State Department under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. We provided documents obtained from states. You know that New York Attorney General recruited a coalition of, they all happen to be activist Democrat attorneys general. Yep. His recruiting letter from March of 2016 to use racketeering laws and otherwise go after the opposition for fraud and racketeering because the proper democratic process is standing in their way. His recruiting letter states why that RICO coalition was formed. To enable it was to ensure the promises made in Paris become reality. That was the quote. To ensure that the promises made in Paris become reality is why you see this ugly, scandalous abuse of law enforcement office that is going to cost, I'm convinced, at least one of them their career. Going after political opponents for fraud, just threatening to investigate them because they're standing in the way of a very lucrative political agenda.
So we've got a lot of exciting legal action to come there, do you think?
Yes, and that's, by the way, so everyone knows that is the issue that carried the day. It's strange to me, but telling, that the left is now dedicating so much energy to saying that's not actually what happened. I assure you, at the time, that was the discussion. That's when it turned, and it was the White House counsel who recognized this and told the president, in the end, you've got real problems if you stay in this. And the UN has come out advocating it since. There have been opinions. It's quite clear they plan to not make the Paris Treaty just politically binding. They plan to use the courts, and the UN Environment Program issued a paper. We couldn't have paid them with better timing. May 24th, they issued a paper saying, here's how you use the courts to hold countries to their promises.
So that's interesting. We won ultimately on a technicality, not on the issue, not on the arguments that we would argue on, that it's just bad for the American economy, etc., but ultimately because the lawyers realized that it would bind the American government.
Well, I can tell you it's the argument we made. And Marla Lewis and I released a substantial paper, maybe 10 days before the decision, laying this out. It's not, the issue isn't legally binding. The question is increased legal risk, and it is inarguable. And the claims that were made, oh, no, the language can mean whatever you want, and oh, no, we have no intention of doing this, while the evidence was piling up that they were talking through their hat. Things played out very well, and they played out properly. Now, as I said, that was a speech. It has to be formalized.
Yes,
there are several options.
Okay, so we're sort of winning. Well, we're heading in the right direction, but where do we go from here? Should we feel confident that good stuff's going to happen, or do you fear many obstacles are going to be thrown in our path, which ultimately may stymie us?
The Remain camp has not given up, and they serve at very high levels in the White House, and the people who lost have made it clear to the people who prevailed that this ain't over, and this comes from the White House. So what they plan to do is the path, this hasn't been announced, but it was in a phone call that did happen that was leaked. The White House has said what we're going to do is follow the Paris withdrawal, Article 28 withdrawal. He just said he's going, and implied he's going to get out using the Paris mechanism, but that's what they plan to do now, which means 3 years after it goes into effect, in November 2019, they can send a letter that takes effect 1 year thereafter, the day after the next presidential election. Okay. That can be undone in a turnkey fashion if he loses his campaign for re-election, assuming he runs for re-election. So there are options on the table to, get him to change his mind, to say, President Trump, you can be the master deal maker here. You can have the Europeans come around. But remember, there are efforts to renegotiate underway. That's a whole nother discussion. If the EU stops being the EU, they're going to recognize that this is very much in their interest. The problem is if we renegotiate anything that the EU might agree, which is essentially claiming the language doesn't mean anything, you can change your promise any way you like. It means the opposite of what it says. In that event, and the president claims I've negotiated a fair deal, which is what he calls it, we are right back into the legal risk, all of the legal risk. The reason he finally decided to get out will be ignored in the renegotiation. In fact, there's nothing you could renegotiate that I can even conceive of that would solve the problem that is the reason he got out. I hope that's not too weedy, but what it leads us to saying is the Senate ultimately will need to get involved. We do need to somehow formally recognize it's a treaty. The president needs to tell any family members of his, for example, who are concerned, well,
any daughters, for example.
Theoretically, I'll just do what the French are doing. I'm going to send it to my Senate for ratification.
Oh, right.
And watch the French go through the roof saying, how dare you do what we did? And that, to me, is the ultimate political solution.
But, Chris, can I just ask you, but before you sort of wind up this one, but the Paris Agreement is just a tiny, tiny little sort of bobble on the tip of the iceberg of the problems facing us. I mean, there's so much more stuff that Trump's got to do to so much more. I mean, for example, why is NASA and NOAA, why are they still under the control of climate alarmists? Why hasn't there been a purge? Why haven't real scientists been put there instead? Why hasn't he got a science czar yet?
There hasn't been. You could ask this, and many have, about any agency. And I just saw a call by some group or groups the other day saying enough is enough is enough. You've got to get the resistance out of their positions. These are taxpayer servants who are working to undermine the people they work for, which you can play the game if the shoe were on the other foot, would be the front page of the New York Times and Washington Post for weeks. Obviously, someone has advised him that you can do a lot more with less. Look at the presidential campaign and how you won with a much smaller staff and spending much less money. I do think that at some point it will be realized, if it hasn't been already, that you do need your bureaucrats telling their bureaucrats what to do, to the extent they haven't taken retirement packages, to the extent you haven't slimmed down the agencies beyond more than just not filling positions. I will say on that front, there's been a very good start. There are stories of furniture, empty offices, and furniture lining the halls of the State Department. Rex Tillerson did cancel the incoming class of Foreign Service officers and told them, go back to your job in advertising or whatever. We have a lot of buyout offers in the works, packages for reducing the rate of growth at bare minimum of agencies. Purge hasn't happened. I will tell you that I'm facing this on many issues in litigation. There's no one home in many senior positions to stop Department of Justice or other lawyers from continuing to defend in court at taxpayer expense Obama initiatives that we have been fighting against and still are. Even just document requests. You know, Mr. President, this isn't gentlemen reading each other's mail. This is the taxpayer's mail. You should have somebody come in and do a quick review. What are we fighting to keep from the public that the public ought to see? I bet that would change a lot of. That would be a game changer on many issues. I could rattle off a handful right now, but the people just haven't been named for appointment, and to the extent they haven't been confirmed by the Senate. So there's a real bottleneck. And right now, what you're seeing is cancellation of incoming classes and buyouts and not filling positions when individuals retire. But all of the things you mentioned are, I believe, the subject of a long view that people have for late year 2, year 3.
Late year 2 or 3. What do you think realistically we can expect next? What's the next big thing, the big good thing that could happen?
On the issues that I concern myself with, I expect to see the same arguments that led Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator, to zealously advocate getting out of the Paris Treaty apply to the basis for the Obama global warming rules, which were the principal vehicle for complying with or trying to comply with the Paris Treaty the first time around, the first 5-year plan. He's got to do something about certain steps taken by the Obama administration. He's got to undo them, and I think what you're going to see is something on the climate front out of EPA. And I don't know anything. I just think that the noises he's making is he's taking various steps that were not what were recommended, but ultimately to air the science and say, look, this endangerment finding, carbon dioxide emissions from man are endanger human health and welfare. That was 9 years ago, and or whenever he gets around to saying this, And it is entirely reasonable, given that the role this is intended to play in the United States economy, that we revisit 9 years of observations, 9 years of innovation, 9 years of advancement, 9 years of refutation of alarmist models. How could you not?
Could that not be tied in with the red team, blue team thing?
I think that's actually the way. I think that's what he's doing.
Because they need to get rid of that, don't they?
Yes, I don't know how a court doesn't say this doesn't require you.
What I mean is the EPA endangerment finding. I don't see how.
I don't know how you proceed without getting rid of that either.
Exactly, but I understand that Scott Pruitt was quite keen not to fight that for complicated legal reasons.
That was my understanding as well, and what I'm discerning is that he has a less direct way, possibly a more thoughtful way. Instead of just saying, I'm good. For example, the Competitive Enterprise Institute has been reported to have a petition sitting before the agency to reconsider that. Take a second look. It's been 8 years.
Yeah.
There's been no movement on that, and it will take a while before the courts would force the agency to at least give us an answer. It's my understanding that since the agency hasn't seized on that, maybe they don't want to. The red team approach reaches the same end effectively. Yeah. And it probably has a stronger public educational component to it. That is, you can do, like the administrator suggested, we could debate this out in the open. In fact, I think we ought to televise it.
Finally, the red team, blue team thing. Who's going to adjudicate ultimately about on this? Will it be lawyers? Will it be the Supreme Court? Or would it be who?
No. What we have is a doctrine that is the subject of great debate, deference. The courts defer to the agency experts. This operates on an assumption that the agency is not filled with political hacks or axe grinders, but in fact experts. Pause, wait for laughter. So anyway, the courts tend to like deferring to Obama-type EPAs better than they like deferring to Trump-style EPA decisions. But the doctrine nonetheless applies to both while we still have it. Again, it's the subject of great debate. It was the subject of, Neil Gorsuch, the newest Supreme Court justice, Trump's appointee. He doesn't like deference. He thinks that's been used as a tool to allow agencies to get away with regulatory murder. That's very relevant here. It was because of that Obama was able to get away with so much in rewriting existing laws that he implicitly acknowledged didn't give him the power to do what he was trying to do. He tried to get cap and trade through Congress. The Democratic Congress killed it. So he said, it turns out I have the authority anyway, and then reinterpreted an old statute saying I have the authority. And the courts give particularly Democratic administrations great deference, but they give agencies deference. You're the experts. We'll go with you have wide latitude. We give you wide berth. Well, while they still have wide berth, while that doctrine is as robust as it is, which some commentators believe is not long for this world, why don't you revisit this and test the deference? What I'm saying is the agency would decide it, and the court would decide whether or not to grant them the deference. Now, they typically do. Would they still? EPA would say, our red team, blue team has come up with the following, and I have to say, let's say red team prevailed, in my opinion, for the following reasons. And in fact, the last 8 years have favored us with the following developments. I have to say that, and I don't know where he's going with this, whether it's I have to say EPA has no proper tool to deal with any potential endangerment we see, or whatever their legal or theory would be, I don't know. But they would inherently, I think, be relying upon this deference doctrine, as every agency does, but in a way that, in my mind, would be far less abusive than the Obama team did, where they just declared an endangerment. They outsourced it to the IPCC, really, and the courts said, you're allowed to do this. Scott Pruitt is allowed to do this, too, with 8 more years of observation and intelligence under our belt. Red team, blue team may be his way of getting there.
Right. We're going to have to leave it there, Chris, and it makes me unhappy slightly because it leaves a situation where the lawyers, yet again, like the cockroaches that inherit the earth after the apocalypse, the lawyers rule everything, don't they? Your kind. But I'm glad you've been fighting the good fight for us, and I'm encouraged.
You should be encouraged.
Yeah.
These are interesting times, but in a good way.
Oh, we're winning. Yeah. Winning. Hashtag winning.
Winning, not won. Winning, not won.
Winning, not won, everyone. Thank you so much to my very special guest, Chris Horner. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. Thank you and goodbye.